In March 2022, Florida released 3 million native solitary bees into 15,000 acres of burned forest in the Apalachicola National Forest. Ecologists predicted 20 to 30% vegetation recovery within 18 months based on natural regeneration models. By October 2023, vegetation coverage had reached 91%. Plant diversity increased by 340%. Soil microbial activity was 7 times higher than untreated burned areas. And the forest canopy, which should have taken 8 to 10 years to establish, was already forming after just 18 months. The reforestation program that was supposed to be a modest success became the fastest forest recovery ever documented in North American ecological restoration. And it happened because Florida did something no one had tried before at this scale. Releasing millions of native ground-nesting bees into devastated landscape and letting them do what 400 million years of evolution designed them to do. This is what happened in those burned forests, why the results shocked every ecologist studying it, and why this experiment might completely change how we think about reforestation after wildfires. In June 2021, the Bertha Swamp Fire burned through 15,000 acres of longleaf pine forest in northwest Florida. This wasn't a Hollywood inferno with 100-foot flames. Longleaf pine ecosystems evolved with fire. They're supposed to burn every 2 to 3 years in low-intensity ground fires that clear undergrowth and trigger pine cone release. But this fire was different. A decade of fire suppression had allowed massive fuel buildup. When the fire finally came, it burned hot enough to kill mature trees and sterilize topsoil. The intense heat destroyed not just vegetation but the seed bank buried in soil. It killed mycorrhizal fungi networks that trees depend on for nutrient uptake. It eliminated the insect populations that pollinate native plants and decompose organic matter. What was left was ecological devastation. Dead tree trunks standing like tombstones. No undergrowth, no flowers, no insects, just sterile ash and heat-damaged soil that couldn't support plant growth even if seeds were present. The traditional approach to this level of destruction is mechanical replanting. Crews come in with seedlings, dig holes, plant trees in grids, and hope 40 to 50% survive. It's expensive, labor-intensive, and produces forests that look like plantations rather than natural ecosystems. Recovery takes decades, but the Florida Forest Service tried something radical instead. They partnered with entomologists at the University of Florida who'd been studying native bee populations. The hypothesis was simple but unprecedented at this scale. If you reintroduce the pollinators before you replant anything, would they accelerate natural regeneration enough to matter? No one expected what happened next. When most people hear bees, they think honeybees, the European honeybee that lives in hives and makes honey. But honeybees are livestock. They're domesticated insects imported from Europe. They're generalist pollinators that visit any flower for nectar. Native bees are completely different animals. North America has over 4,000 native bee species. Most are solitary, meaning each female builds her own nest rather than living in colonies. Many are specialists that evolved alongside specific native plants over millions of years. And most nest in the ground rather than in hives. The species Florida released were primarily southeastern blueberry bees, Habropoda laboriosa, and various Andrena ground-nesting species. These bees are Florida natives that evolved in longleaf pine ecosystems. They're specialist pollinators for dozens of native wildflower species that honeybees largely ignore. But here's what makes them revolutionary for reforestation. These bees don't just pollinate. They're ecosystem engineers. When a female ground-nesting bee digs her nest, she excavates soil, bringing nutrients from deeper layers to the surface. She provisions each egg chamber with pollen, which is essentially concentrated plant protein. When larvae develop and emerge, they leave behind fecal matter and dead provisions that enrich the soil with nitrogen and organic compounds. A single female Andrena bee will dig a nest 10 to 15 inches deep and create 15 to 20 egg chambers per season. Multiply that by millions of bees, and you have millions of small-scale soil disturbance events that aerate compacted soil, redistribute nutrients, and create microhabitats where seeds can germinate. These bees emerge incredibly early in spring, which means they're pollinating the pioneer plants that stabilize soil and prepare it for later successional species. Florida released 3 million of these bees across 15,000 acres in March 2022. That's roughly 200 bees per acre. For context, a healthy wild bee population is maybe 50 to 100 bees per acre. They intentionally overstocked by 2 to 4 times normal density. Ecologists thought this was excessive. The prediction was that most would disperse or die off as food became scarce. Instead, the bees stayed, and they got to work. By June 2022, vegetation coverage in the bee-treated areas had reached 34%. In control areas of burned forest with no bee introduction, vegetation was at 8%. This was already anomalous, 4 times faster recovery than predicted, but ecologists attributed it to favorable spring rains and assumed the gap would narrow. But the plant diversity numbers were baffling. The bee-treated zones had 87 different plant species established. Control zones had 23 species. This made no sense under standard succession models. Early succession after fire should be dominated by a few aggressive pioneer species, grasses, and fast-growing weeds. Diversity should increase slowly over years as different species establish. What was happening in the bee zones was more like mid-succession plant communities appearing in month 3. Wildflowers that shouldn't establish until year 2 or 3 were already blooming. Shrub species that typically take 5 to 7 years to colonize were sending up shoots. Dr. Sarah Chen, the University of Florida entomologist leading the study, was confused. The bees were pollinating flowers, yes, but there shouldn't be this many flowers this fast. Where were the seeds coming from? Soil analysis revealed the answer. The intense fire had buried seeds deeper into the soil rather than destroying them all. Most seeds remained dormant because they were too deep for light to trigger germination. But the ground-nesting bees, digging their nests, were excavating those buried seeds and bringing them to the surface. Each bee nest became a seed redistribution event. They moved soil containing dormant seeds to the surface where light and moisture could trigger germination. The bees weren't just pollinating plants, they were literally mining the seed bank and planting it. This was a mechanism no one had predicted. Standard reforestation models assume seed dispersal comes from surrounding forest or wind. The bees were accessing seeds that would have remained dormant for years and activating them immediately. By November 2022, soil microbial analysis showed something unprecedented. Bee-treated areas had microbial biomass levels 7.2 times higher than control burned areas. Mycorrhizal fungi networks, which should take 3 to 5 years to re-establish, were already forming connections between plant roots. Ecologists were calling this impossible. Mycorrhizal fungi are sensitive organisms that die in intense fire. They can't recolonize quickly because they spread slowly through soil. Yet somehow, bee-treated zones had functioning fungal networks in under a year. The explanation required looking at what ground-nesting bees do underground. When a female provisions her nest with pollen and nectar, she's creating nutrient-rich chambers. When larvae develop, they excrete waste products high in nitrogen. When adults emerge, they leave behind cocoon material, dead mites, and fecal deposits. Each nest becomes a fertilized microhabitat. Bee nests create air pockets and tunnels that stay open after bees emerge. These tunnels become highways for fungal hyphae to spread through soil faster than they could penetrate compacted, burned earth. The bees were accidentally building fungal infrastructure. Their nests created the three-dimensional network of channels that fungi could colonize, dramatically accelerating fungal spread across the landscape. But there's more. Analysis showed that bees were inadvertently transporting fungal spores on their bodies. As they foraged from the unburned forest edges into burned zones, they carried mycorrhizal spores on their leg hairs and body fuzz. Each bee became a mobile dispersal unit for the exact fungi that plants needed to establish. No one designed this. The bees were just doing what bees do. By March 2023, 1 year after bee introduction, pine seedlings in treated areas were averaging 18 inches in height. Control areas had pine seedlings averaging 4 inches. Both areas had similar seedling density, of around 300 per acre from natural seed dispersal. Seedlings in bee zones were growing 4.5 times faster. This growth rate suggested they had access to resources that control seedlings didn't. Soil analysis confirmed it. Nitrogen levels in bee-treated soil were 340% higher than control soil. Phosphorus was 280% higher, and mycorrhizal colonization of pine roots was nearly universal in bee zones versus 12% in control zones. The underground ecosystem the bees had built was feeding the trees. Pine seedlings with mycorrhizal partners grow faster because the fungi extend their root systems and provide nutrients in exchange for sugars. In normal succession, mycorrhizal colonization is a bottleneck that slows tree growth for years. The bees had eliminated that bottleneck, but there was another factor no one anticipated. The wildflower diversity the bees had pollinated created a plant community that included nitrogen-fixing legumes. These plants pull nitrogen from the air and deposit it in soil. In bee zones, nitrogen-fixing plants were 8 times more abundant than control zones. The bees had accidentally assembled a plant community that fertilized itself. By pollinating everything indiscriminately, they'd enabled nitrogen fixers to establish early, which enriched soil for non-nitrogen-fixing plants, which created more diverse plant communities, which supported more pollinator habitat, which sustained the bee population. It was a positive feedback loop, and it was accelerating. By October 2023, the numbers were so far outside predicted ranges that multiple research teams arrived to verify the data. Vegetation coverage was 91% in bee zones versus 31% in control zones. Plant species diversity was 340% higher. Tree seedling density was similar, but average height in bee zones was 28 inches versus 7 inches in controls. Most shocking was canopy closure. Young forests typically take 8 to 10 years to develop enough tree growth that canopies touch and shade the ground. Bee-treated areas were showing early canopy formation after 18 months. The trees weren't mature, but they were dense enough and tall enough that understory light levels were already dropping. This suggested the forest would reach functional maturity years ahead of any natural regeneration timeline. And the plant community composition looked nothing like early succession. It looked like mid-succession forest structure with high diversity and multiple canopy layers already forming. Dr. Chen's team published preliminary findings in Ecological Applications in November 2023. The paper was blunt about how unprecedented this was. Pollinator-mediated acceleration of post-fire succession exceeded all predicted models by factors of 3 to 7 across multiple metrics. The mechanism appears to be multifactorial ecosystem engineering by ground-nesting bees affecting seed dispersal, soil structure, microbial community establishment, and nutrient cycling simultaneously. But here's what the paper emphasized. This wasn't just faster regrowth. It was higher quality ecosystem recovery. The plant communities were more diverse, the soil biology was more complex, and the forest structure was more resilient than mechanically replanted forests of similar age. Natural regeneration assisted by pollinators was outperforming human reforestation by every metric. The Apalachicola experiment revealed something fundamental that reforestation science had missed. We'd been thinking about forests as plant communities. Ground cover. We'd been replanting forests by replanting plants. But forests aren't plant communities. They're ecological networks where plants, pollinators, soil microbes, and nutrient cycles interact in ways that create the conditions for forest existence. You can't rebuild a forest by only replacing the plants any more than you can rebuild a computer by only replacing the screen. The bees weren't just pollinating, they were reconstructing the underground architecture that forests depend on, endurating soil, redistributing nutrients, dispersing fungal spores, mining buried seeds, creating microhabitats, building fungal highways, establishing nutrient cycling, and they were doing it at scale and speed that human intervention can't match. 3 million bees working continuously for 18 months performed more ecological engineering than mechanical reforestation crews could do in 10 years with 100 times the budget. But here's the most important finding. This approach cost roughly $180,000 for bee propagation and release across 15,000 acres. That's $12 per acre. Traditional mechanical reforestation costs $400 to $800 per acre and produces worse results. The bee approach was 97% cheaper and produced forest recovery 3 to 7 times faster with higher biodiversity and more resilient ecosystem structure. Oregon is launching a pilot program in 2024. Forest Service is developing protocols for pollinator-assisted restoration as standard practice after major wildfires. The paradigm is shifting from mechanical reforestation to ecological reconstruction. Instead of planting trees and hoping they survive, we're rebuilding the ecological networks that create conditions where forests regenerate themselves. Faster, cheaper, and more effectively than we could do manually. But this approach has a critical requirement. You need native bee populations to release. Florida had been culturing native bees for agricultural pollination for years. They had the infrastructure to breed and release 3 million bees. Most regions don't. Native bee propagation is difficult. These species are solitary. Many have complex life cycles, and they're harder to breed than honeybees. Building the capacity to produce millions of native bees takes years of infrastructure development and expertise that most states don't have. There's also timing sensitivity. Bees must be released when early wildflowers are blooming so they have immediate food sources. Release too early and they starve. Release too late and you miss the critical early succession window. Getting this right requires understanding local phenology. And this approach only works where native seed banks still exist. If fire completely sterilizes soil, there are no buried seeds for bees to excavate. In those cases, mechanical replanting is still necessary. Introducing pollinators accelerates the growth of replanted seedlings through their effects on soil and fungi. The Florida success is replicable, but not automatically transferable. Each region needs to develop native bee propagation programs, study local pollinator ecology, and adapt the approach to their specific plant communities and fire regimes. That takes time and money that most state agencies don't currently have allocated. But given the cost savings and effectiveness improvements, those investments pay for themselves within years. The bee-treated zones are now self-sustaining ecosystems. The initial 3 million released bees have established breeding populations that will maintain themselves without human intervention. The plant communities are diverse enough to support pollinators year-round. The soil biology is robust. The forest is regenerating on its own. Monitoring will continue through 2030 to track long-term outcomes. But the trajectory is clear, and the bees are still there. Population surveys show stable native bee densities around 140 per acre across treated areas. They didn't die off or disperse once the ecosystem established. They found what they needed to persist. Florida released 3 million native bees into burned forest. Those bees rebuilt an ecosystem from ash in 18 months. They did what 400 million years of evolution designed them to do. And they proved that sometimes the best way to restore nature is to reintroduce the engineers that built it in the first place and then get out of their way. The regrowth wasn't beyond prediction because bees are magical. It was beyond prediction because we'd been modeling forests without modeling the ecological engineering that creates forests. Now we know better. And burn zones across America might recover faster because Florida figured out what happens when you let 3 million bees do what they're built for.